I'll never forget the sound the door made when I kicked it open. It wasn't just wood splintering against a lock. It was the sound of something inside me breaking clean in two. The first thing my eyes locked on was Brianna, my fiancée, the woman I had been planning to marry in less than 6 months. She wasn't just in bed. She wasn't just cheating. She was naked, down on all fours, her hair flying across her shoulders as she moaned another man's name into the sheets. Not mine. Curtis. The second thing I saw was him. Curtis, smirking at me, arrogant as hell, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. He didn't scramble for his clothes. He didn't flinch. He just looked me dead in the eye while my fiancée collapsed into panic beside him, clutching the blanket like a drowning woman grabbing driftwood. I should have swung. God knows my fists itched. But something inside me shifted in that moment. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was rage so sharp it froze. But I didn't hit him. I didn't scream at her. I just stood there. And then slowly, without breaking eye contact, I pulled out my phone. I hit record. The red light blinked. Brianna's sobs filled the room. Curtis's smirk faltered. "You think this is funny?" I said, my voice calm. Too calm. I barely recognized it myself. "Because the second I send this, every one of your friends, your family, her family, hell, your boss, will see exactly what I saw." That smirk finally died. He shifted back, suddenly not so cocky, eyes darting from me to Brianna. "David, stop," Brianna whispered, her voice cracking. She clutched the blanket tighter, like she could somehow disappear into it. "Please. You can't." But I could. And she knew it. I took one step into the room, keeping my phone raised. The power shifted instantly. For the first time that night, I wasn't the broken man who had walked in on his fiancée cheating. I was the executioner, and the gallows was sitting right there in my hand. "Here's how this goes," I said, steady. "You don't tell anyone you've seen me. You don't try to twist this into some story about me being crazy, obsessive, violent. Because if you do, this video goes out. If either of you so much as breathes wrong, it goes out." Curtis's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to call my bluff. But then he glanced at the blinking red light again and stayed silent. Brianna, meanwhile, broke down. The tears, the begging, the apologies all spilled out in one incoherent mess. But I didn't care. For years, I had bent over backwards for her. Paid her tuition when she was short. Covered rent when her job didn't pull enough hours. Planned a wedding that was supposed to be her dream. And now this was what she gave me in return. I let the silence hang long enough for her sobs to fill the air. Then I pocketed the phone. "You'll hear from me," I said simply, and walked out. The night air hit me like a slap. I got into my car, hands shaking against the wheel, and sat there for a long time. My chest was tight, like every breath scraped against glass. Part of me wanted to drive off a bridge. Another part wanted to storm back in there and beat Curtis until he couldn't smirk again. But I didn't. I drove. No destination, just the road stretching in front of me. I must have gone 50 miles before I finally stopped at a gas station and sat in the glow of the fluorescent lights. My phone buzzed with texts from Brianna, then calls, then voicemails. I didn't answer. When I finally pulled into Nolan's driveway at 2 in the morning, he was still awake. Nolan had been my best friend since high school. The kind of guy who could read me before I opened my mouth. One look at my face, and he knew. "What happened?" he asked, standing in the doorway, eyes narrowing. "She was with him," I said. My voice cracked on the words, but I forced them out. "Curtis. I caught them. I recorded it." Nolan went still. Then his jaw tightened the way it did when he was trying not to explode. "That son of a bitch," he muttered. He motioned me inside, shoved a beer into my hand, and sat me down. "You're not going to just sit here and take it, right?" I shook my head. "I'm not going to hit him. I'm not going to scream at her. I'm going to make them choke on it. Every second. Every breath. They're going to know I could ruin them at any moment." Nolan leaned back slowly, a dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Now that's the David I know. Cold. Calculated. They won't see it coming." The next morning, Brianna showed up at my apartment. I didn't open the door. I let her cry in the hallway, banging on the frame, begging to talk. When she finally gave up and left, I texted her one line. "You'll do exactly as I say, or the video goes to your parents." Her reply came fast. "Please, don't. We can work this out." But it was too late for working things out. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about leverage. I drafted a list that night. Everything she owed me, wedding deposits, tuition I'd covered, rent I'd paid. Every dollar added up into a neat, ugly sum. I sent her the total with another message. "You pay me back, or the video spreads. Your choice." Hours passed. No reply. Then, finally, "I don't have that kind of money. Please, just delete it. Please." I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh escaping me. For years, she'd treated me like a safety net. And now she wanted me to delete the only thing keeping me in control? Not a chance. Curtis tried calling me next. He sounded calm, trying to play it cool, telling me I was bluffing. I didn't even argue. I just forwarded him a draft email addressed to his boss with the video file attached. No words, just the draft. His call ended in less than 2 seconds. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. But here's the thing about blackmail. It doesn't just trap the person you're holding it over. It traps them together. Brianna and Curtis were now bound by my silence. The more desperate she became, the more she leaned on him. The more he resented her for dragging him down, the more cracks would spread between them. And all I had to do was wait. By the end of the first week, Brianna caved enough to send me the first transfer. A pitiful amount compared to what she owed, but it was a start. Curtis, meanwhile, went silent. Too silent. Nolan warned me he'd try something reckless. Guys like him don't like being leashed, he said. Keep your guard up. I nodded. But deep down, I was almost hoping Curtis would try. Because the truth was, I wanted him to. I wanted him to step into my trap so I could pull the noose tighter. And in the back of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. The silence after that first week was deceptive. Brianna had sent me a partial payment, clearly scraped together in panic, but I knew it hadn't come from her own pocket. It reeked of Curtis's reluctant hand. He wasn't doing it out of guilt. He was buying time. I could almost see him pacing, teeth clenched, waiting for me to slip up. But I wasn't going to. I had spent years compromising, bending, apologizing, swallowing my pride. That version of me died the second I saw her naked on all fours, begging for him. What replaced it wasn't merciful. I laid out the next demand. I wanted the wedding deposits covered, in full. I had kept all the receipts, all the paperwork neatly stacked in a folder like some cruel premonition. I wasn't bluffing when I told her the cancellation would bankrupt her parents' goodwill. It was already humiliating enough that people would learn why the engagement collapsed. If they also had to eat thousands of dollars in wasted money, her life would turn into a social funeral. She tried calling again, this time her voice low, rehearsed, almost businesslike. She said she couldn't get that much on her own. I told her that wasn't my problem. The weight of silence over the phone was almost satisfying. She knew what I meant. Curtis had to pay. He was the one who smirked while destroying my life. Now he could fund the cleanup. 2 days later, Nolan told me Curtis had shown up at his bar. Nolan worked nights, and he'd spotted Curtis drinking hard, muttering about me to anyone who'd listen. According to Nolan, the tough guy act was starting to crack. The arrogance was there, but so was frustration. He wasn't used to being trapped. That was when I made the second move. I didn't send the full video anywhere. I didn't need to. Instead, I cropped still images from it. Just enough to tell a story without revealing everything. One frame with Brianna's face clear, another with Curtis's smug expression. Then I blurred the rest and sent them to Brianna's closest friend, the one she confided in about every wedding plan. I didn't include a note, just the images. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread. Mutual acquaintances started reaching out to me in vague, hesitant ways, asking if it was true, if I was okay. I didn't confirm, didn't deny. The silence worked better than any words. Within a week, Brianna had gone from playing damage control to full-blown panic. The next time she reached out, she wasn't crying. She was furious. She demanded to know what my endgame was, what I thought I'd achieve by dragging her through the mud. I didn't need to answer. The real answer was already in motion: isolation. People had stopped defending her. The same voices that once swore she was the perfect bride-to-be now muttered about betrayal, about disgrace, about a fall from the pedestal she'd built for herself. Curtis, meanwhile, tried to intimidate me directly. I came home one night and found him leaning against the hood of my car in the lot. He looked relaxed, arms folded, but the message was clear. He wanted to scare me back into silence. He started talking, low and measured, about how he wasn't afraid of me, how people like me always caved eventually, how one little file didn't make me king of the world. I didn't rise to it. Instead, I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and switched on the dashcam feed. His face filled the screen. I didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes told me he understood. If he laid a hand on me, he'd be the one explaining to the police why he'd been caught threatening me on camera. I let the engine roar to life, pulled out of the spot, and left him standing there, smaller than I'd ever seen him. That was the moment I realized how much the tables had turned. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't the one in control. He was reacting, scrambling. And the more he squirmed, the tighter the leash got. The pressure began to break them apart. Brianna started sending frantic messages late at night, sometimes begging, sometimes raging, always circling the same question: what would it take for me to stop? I never gave her a straight answer. I just kept the demands coming in waves. First the deposits, then the tuition reimbursements, then the rent I'd covered. Each demand came with a ticking clock in my messages, and each time, she folded further. Nolan watched the transformation with me, half in awe, half in disgust. He told me once over a beer that I looked like a man who had found a new drug, that the power was eating at me. Maybe he was right. But when you've been humiliated in front of the world, the feeling of pulling strings behind the curtain becomes addictive. Her family eventually got dragged into it without even realizing. I knew Brianna had been lying to them, spinning some story about me backing out of the wedding at the last minute. But families talk. They asked questions. They heard rumors. And slowly, their patience with her frayed. One night, Nolan told me he overheard her father at a community event, muttering about being embarrassed, about not knowing what their daughter had done. It was working. The blackmail wasn't just about money. It was about social suffocation. Every time she thought she could breathe, I tightened it again. Curtis, on the other hand, grew reckless. He wasn't built for restraint. I heard from mutual friends that he'd gotten into fights at bars, that he was snapping at co-workers, that he'd even thrown a punch at one of Brianna's cousins when the guy made a joke. Each story painted a clearer picture. He was unraveling. I kept the pressure on him directly, too. Every couple of weeks, I'd forward him the same draft email to his boss, updated with a different subject line. I never sent it. I just let him stew in the knowledge that I could at any moment. He started calling less, stopped posturing, avoided me entirely. That silence was as good as a confession. What fascinated me most was watching Brianna and Curtis turn on each other. Their texts, when they accidentally bled into mine through shared contacts, showed the cracks. She accused him of dragging her into this. He accused her of ruining his life. Their arguments leaked through neighbors' thin walls, loud enough that friends began gossiping about the nightly screaming matches. It was almost poetic. The same bed where they thought they had won, where Curtis smirked at me in triumph, had turned into an arena of resentment. The climax of this phase came at a restaurant. Nolan had insisted on taking me out, said I needed a night where I wasn't scheming, just eating a decent meal. We picked a place we used to hit in college, somewhere neutral. Halfway through the meal, the door opened, and in walked Brianna and Curtis. The timing felt like fate. Their eyes locked on me instantly. She looked exhausted, makeup caked on too thick to hide the circles under her eyes. He looked thinner, sharper, like a man being eaten from the inside out. They sat across the room, but the tension traveled like a current. Nolan leaned over and muttered that I could cut the air with a knife. I didn't acknowledge them directly. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the folder labeled insurance, and laid it on the table where they could see. I didn't lift my eyes once, but I knew they were watching. Brianna's hand shook as she lifted her glass. Curtis's leg bounced so hard it rattled the table. We finished our meal in silence, paid the bill, and left without a word. But the message had been carved into stone. I owned them. After that night, the payments started arriving faster. Smaller amounts, more frequent, desperate attempts to buy time. They were running out of resources. Curtis had burned too many bridges, and Brianna had no safety net left. I didn't feel guilty. If anything, I felt sharper, more alive, more in control than I ever had. Every time I watched another transfer hit my account, I remembered the sound of her moaning his name, of him smirking in triumph. This was justice, not the kind a courtroom would deliver, the kind only humiliation and fear could carve. Nolan kept me tethered. He reminded me not to push too far, not to burn myself in the process. But even he admitted there was a grim satisfaction in watching them crumble. He told me once that it was like watching a slow-motion car crash, one where the passengers deserved every shard of glass. By the end of the second month, Brianna was a shell of who she had been. She used to walk into rooms like she owned them, laughing too loud, commanding attention. Now she kept her head down, avoided eye contact, and stumbled through conversations. Curtis barely appeared in public at all. When he did, he was angry, reckless, dangerous in the way a trapped animal becomes when it knows the cage is closing. And me? I was steady. For the first time in years, steady. I knew it wouldn't last forever. Blackmail isn't a permanent state. It's a storm. Eventually, it either passes or consumes everything. But until then, I held the reins. The next move was coming. I could feel it in my bones. Curtis wouldn't sit in silence much longer. Brianna wouldn't keep sending money forever. Something was going to break, and I was ready for it. By the third month, the mask had completely slipped from both of them. The Brianna who once paraded me in front of her friends like a prize was now a ghost, drifting from one humiliation to the next. The Curtis who once smirked at me like a man untouchable was now avoiding my shadow like a fugitive. But pressure like that doesn't dissolve quietly. It cracks. It splinters. And eventually, it explodes. The first real rupture came late on a Thursday night. Nolan called me, his voice low but sharp. He said he'd just seen Curtis outside my building, pacing, cigarette after cigarette burning down to the filter. He wasn't there to smoke. He was working up the nerve to do something stupid. I didn't leave my apartment. I stayed by the window, lights off, watching him below. His movements were jerky, restless, the way men move when desperation boils into violence. He made a phone call, short and heated. He kicked the curb, cursed into the dark, then finally stalked off. I slept lightly that night, every creak of the hallway stirring me awake. But nothing came. Curtis had retreated. For now. A week later, the retaliation came not in fists, but in whispers. Brianna showed up at my job. She had always been bold, but now she looked worn down, her hair unkempt, eyes hollow. She asked to see me in private. Against my better judgment, I agreed. She accused me of ruining her life, of bleeding her dry, of turning her into a pariah. She said people were talking behind her back, that even her coworkers looked at her differently. The words came fast, not because she wanted to convince me, but because she wanted to convince herself she still had some power. Then she tried to flip the script. She threatened to tell people that I was the one harassing her, that I was stalking, manipulating, controlling. It was a desperate bluff. I could see it in her trembling hands, in the way her voice cracked at the edges. I leaned across the table and told her one simple truth. If she pushed that narrative, the video would surface in full, without edits, without mercy. She froze. She knew I wasn't bluffing. The meeting ended with her storming out, but I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. She was already circling the drain. Curtis, however, wasn't done testing me. 2 nights later, my car alarm went off at 3 in the morning. I looked out the window to see him crouched by the driver's side, something metallic glinting in his hand. By the time I made it outside, he was gone, but the evidence was clear, deep scratches carved into the paint, tires slashed clean through. I didn't file a report. I didn't need police in this game. Instead, I pulled the building's security footage. The cameras had caught everything. Curtis in his hoodie, face half hidden, vandalizing my car like a teenager pulling a prank. I didn't send it to the police. I sent it to him. His reply came within minutes. A single message, no words, just 3 dots blinking and then disappearing. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't try to justify it. He knew he'd lost again. The next morning, the payment that was overdue hit my account in full. But the damage wasn't just between me and them anymore. Their implosion had become public theater. Nolan told me that people in Brianna's circle had stopped inviting her out. When she did show up, the air shifted, conversations faltered, whispers trailed behind her. Curtis wasn't any better. His temper at work had gotten him written up twice, and his coworkers openly mocked him behind his back. Even Brianna's family had begun to fracture. Her parents had reached out to mine, fishing for explanations, trying to piece together why everything had collapsed so suddenly. My parents stayed vague, but they didn't defend her. Word was spreading in the quiet, devastating way that ruins reputations permanently. I didn't need to fuel it anymore. The fire had caught. I only had to stand back and watch it burn. The breaking point came one Saturday evening when Nolan and I were out at a local dive bar. I had wanted a night of quiet, of pretending for a few hours that my life wasn't a chessboard. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Curtis walked in. He looked gaunt, his shirt wrinkled, his movements twitchy. He saw me almost instantly, and the air in the room snapped tight. He marched over, fists clenched, and stood over me like a man who'd already lost but wanted one last swing. His voice was low, shaking with fury. He spat words about me ruining his life, about me being pathetic, about how none of this made me a winner. I didn't rise. I didn't shout. I simply reminded him that every single person in that bar had phones, and if he laid a hand on me, he'd be on camera again. This time, not vandalizing a car, but assaulting me in public. He froze. The bar had gone silent, all eyes on us. He realized, in real time, that I wasn't cornered. He was. He backed away, muttering, humiliated, and left before anyone could laugh. The satisfaction wasn't in the victory. It was in the look on his face, the dawning horror of a man realizing he was powerless. Brianna, meanwhile, had shifted from rage to desperation. She sent me long, rambling emails at 3 in the morning. Apologies mixed with accusations, pleas tangled with curses. She begged me to stop, said she'd do anything, offered to sign whatever papers I wanted. I didn't reply. I let her twist in her own words. Her family finally cut her off. I learned through mutual contacts that they had told her to move out, ashamed of the spectacle she had created. Without them, without friends, without Curtis's stability, if he ever had any, she was sinking into isolation. Curtis, predictably, turned on her. The gossip from neighbors painted a vivid picture of screaming matches at all hours, of objects thrown against walls, of doors slammed so hard they rattled the frames. Their love, if it ever existed, had decayed into open warfare. And I had lit the match. The irony was that while they collapsed, my life steadied. Work became sharper. My savings grew as their transfers continued. Even my health improved. I was sleeping more soundly, eating better, carrying myself with a confidence I hadn't known in years. Nolan said I looked like a man who had shed a skin. Maybe he was right. For so long, I'd been the one clinging to Brianna's validation, to the idea of a future with her. Now, that future was ashes, and I was free to rebuild on my terms. But freedom is addictive, and control even more so. The more they cracked, the more I wanted to push. Not just for money, not just for humiliation, but for something deeper. A reckoning. The thought haunted me. How far could I take this before they snapped completely? That question was answered in the most unexpected way. It was late on a Sunday when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was shaky, high-pitched. It was Brianna's younger cousin. She told me that Brianna had shown up at her parents' house, screaming in the driveway, demanding money, threatening to end things if they didn't help her. The scene had drawn half the neighborhood. Her parents finally called the police, not to arrest her, but to remove her. The cousin told me Brianna looked unhinged, hair tangled, mascara streaked down her face. She was begging for help, but nobody wanted to listen anymore. That was when it hit me. I didn't need to destroy her. She was doing it herself. Curtis, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. The following week, rumors spread that he had disappeared for several days. Coworkers said he hadn't shown up. Friends said his phone was off. Brianna, frantic, had been knocking on doors, asking anyone if they'd seen him. When he finally resurfaced, the story was uglier than I expected. He had been holed up at a motel, drinking and gambling what little money he had left. When the creditors caught up, he bolted. The debts he owed weren't small. They weren't the kind you paid off with a paycheck or two. They were the kind that got men chased, cornered, beaten. And now, by extension, Brianna was tied to them. She had hitched her wagon to a man who couldn't even keep himself upright. And now, as he sank, he dragged her deeper into the mud. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. Every move I had made had been about leverage, about power, about flipping the humiliation back on them. But now, they were spiraling on their own. My role was finished. The wheel was spinning, and they were caught beneath it. I sat back and watched. And as I did, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge wasn't about the blow you landed. It was about the silence that followed, the echo of their own downfall. Curtis's unraveling wasn't quiet anymore. His name began popping up in conversations far beyond our circle. Friends whispered about debts unpaid, about threats from people you didn't want to owe. His coworkers stopped mentioning him at all, as if his absence was easier to ignore than the mess he left behind. Brianna, however, was still tethered to him. She had staked everything on Curtis when she chose him over me. Now, she was paying for it in ways I couldn't have orchestrated if I tried. The call started again, frantic, breathless. She said Curtis had disappeared with her bank card, had drained what little savings she had left, and hadn't returned in days. She begged me to delete the video, said it didn't matter anymore, said she'd give me whatever I wanted if I'd just make it stop. I didn't reply. She wasn't begging me for freedom. She was begging me for the illusion that I could undo the consequences she had written for herself. And I wasn't going to give her that comfort. It was Nolan who brought me the final piece of the story. He'd heard through one of his regulars at the bar, someone who ran in Curtis's gambling circles, that Curtis had been cornered. The men he owed weren't interested in excuses anymore. He had either fled town or been forced out of it. Either way, he was gone. That left Brianna alone in the wreckage. I thought she would try to rebuild, maybe find another safety net. But when your reputation is scorched earth, when every friend whispers behind your back and every family dinner ends in silence, there's no net left to catch you. Her downfall became public spectacle. She moved out of her apartment when eviction notices piled up. She picked up shifts at a discount clothing store across town. Once, I stopped in just to see if the rumors were true. She was behind the counter, pale and thinner, hair tied back in a messy knot. When our eyes met, she froze. For a moment, the confident girl I once knew flickered across her face. But then the mask slipped, and I saw only fear. I didn't say a word. I turned, bought nothing, and walked out. The video itself never saw the light of day. I didn't need to send it anywhere. The threat had been enough to ruin them. They had lived months under its shadow, flinching every time their phones buzzed, wondering if this was the moment their world ended. That fear had destroyed them more thoroughly than exposure ever could. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one message left to send. I drafted an email to Brianna's parents. No attachments, no images, just a short, brutal line. Ask your daughter why the wedding is off. That was all it took. I heard later that her father confronted her in a storm of rage. Her mother wept, not for what she had done to me, but for the embarrassment their family had endured. The message spread through relatives quickly. The wedding wasn't a postponement, it was a disgrace. And the blame sat squarely on her shoulders. Brianna's last attempt to reach me came after that. She showed up at my apartment late at night, her knuckles rapping weakly against the door. When I opened it, she looked like someone who had aged a decade in a few months. Her eyes were red, her clothes wrinkled, her voice hoarse. She said she was sorry. She said she never meant for it to go that far. She said Curtis had manipulated her, that she had made mistakes, that she wanted forgiveness. I didn't shout. I didn't laugh. I simply handed her a manila envelope, the final invoice for what she still owed me from the wedding and the years of bills I had covered. Her hands shook as she held it, eyes flicking from the numbers back to me. Then I closed the door. Her sobs trailed into the hallway, but I didn't open it again. Years passed. Curtis vanished into the kind of shadows men like him always do. Last I heard, he'd been picked up in another state for fraud, scamming people in some cheap scheme. It didn't surprise me. Parasites don't change, they just find new hosts. Brianna stayed in town. The last time I saw her was outside a cafe on a cold winter morning. She was hunched in a heavy coat, a name tag pinned to her chest from the retail store where she worked. When our eyes met, she froze again, the same way she had at the counter months earlier. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, maybe another apology, maybe another plea, but I didn't give her the chance. I held her gaze for one long moment, then turned and walked away. Because here's the truth, revenge isn't about the explosion. It's about the silence afterward. It's about the weight they carry long after you've stopped lifting a finger. I never leaked the video. I never had to. The real punishment was knowing I held it, that every smile she faked, every shift she worked, every strained conversation with her parents happened under the shadow of that file. She destroyed her life the second she let Curtis in. I just made sure she could never forget it. The consequences lingered, not just for them, but for me. I learned how easy it was to cross from victim to executioner. I had spent months orchestrating their humiliation, pulling strings like some cold puppeteer. Part of me worried that I'd gone too far. Another part reminded me that they had written this story themselves, and I had only turned the page. Nolan asked me once if I'd do it all again, if I'd choose the same path. I told him yes. Not because I enjoyed the destruction, but because without it, I would have always been the man who was humiliated and left broken on the floor. Instead, I became the man who walked away while the people who betrayed me burned their own world down. That was enough. When I think back to that night, to the door exploding open and Curtis smirking at me like he'd won, I almost laugh. He thought he was on top of the world. She thought she had me wrapped so tightly I'd never escape. But the truth is, betrayal sharpens you. It teaches you who you really are when the mask is ripped off. And me? I wasn't the victim they expected. I was the reckoning they never saw coming. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.